Good evening, friends and family. Thanking you for joining us this evening and taking the time to share some knowledge, share some information, share some teachings about our identity and about our backgrounds. And uh, as we move forward to establish relationships and to build on old relationships, I want to start our work off with a little prayer. So please join me. Join in your own way. Pray in your own way. Ushabit siya. Asking you just a few words here in the language to help us move forward in a good way. Oha shak siabad. Oha shak siabad. Ha te is lechel. Ha te is yayusiyam. Ha te is laguitid. Chas. Oha tsapa. Oha kaya. Ata. Kwaho chao. Ushabit siyam. Asking you, Grandfather, to bless this day, bless this work, calling on you, sacred grandfather, sacred grandmother, to help us with our work, to anchor us and provide us comfort. Let us move forward in a good way, Siam.
Ase.
Thank you, Warren, and you Loet. Thank you. Welcome everyone tonight. We are delighted to have all of you with us for our panel discussion and to join us for a new dialogue among diverse communities impacted by the Puget Sound Treaty War and its aftermath. As we begin, we would like to acknowledge that Fort Nisqually was established and later reconstructed on the shared lands of the Medicine Creek Treaty tribes. As Nisqually historian Cecilia Carpenter has written in her history of Fort Nisqually, this land is Indian country. The men of Hudson's Bay Company were guests here. We encourage each of you to consider the history of the lands you inhabit. I will submit to that chat box shortly a link to an interactive map produced by Native Land Digital, in addition to other recommended educational resources to learn more. And we hope that this is a starting point for you to begin your own research. Tonight, it is my great pleasure to introduce our panelists and moderator, Brandon Rainan, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and Assistant Director for the Puyallup Tribe. Brandon is an enrolled member of the Puyallup Tribe and the great-great-great-great-grandson of Hainuk, a treaty signer and Treaty Wars warrior for the Puyallup. He has been working for the Puyallup Tribe since 2008. Jerry Eckram, historian and author, Fort Nisqually Living History Museum. Jerry is a lifelong resident of Tacoma and has been involved with Fort Nisqually for 30 years or so. And he is the author of Remembered Drums, A History of the Puget Sound Indian War. Margaret Seymour Henry, oral history specialist and cultural resources tech specialist with Squaxin Island Tribe. Margaret is an enrolled member of the Squaxin Island Tribe. Her maternal great-great-grandfather, Johnny Scalapine, was at the signing of the Medicine Creek Treaty as a young man. Margaret is the former curator at the Squaxin Museum, Library, and Resource Center. Netzie Bullchild, Director of the Nisqually Tribal Archives and Nisqually Tribal Historic Preservation Office. Netzie is an enrolled member and elder of the Nisqually Indian Tribe. On her mother's side, Netzie is descended from Nisqually, Cowlitz, and Hawaiian ancestors. On her father's side, she is descended from Puyallup and Scottish ancestors, including John McLeod, a Hudson's Bay Company employee at Fort Nisqually. She has worked with the Nisqually Tribe for over 30 years. And Warren King George, who carries the name Ulowit, with the Muckleshoot Indian Tribe. Warren is an enrolled member of the Muckleshoot Indian Tribe through his father's bloodline and a descendant of the Upper Skagit Tribe through his late mother's bloodline. He has worked for Muckleshoot Preservation Program since 2000. And our moderator tonight is Jennifer Ott, Assistant Director at historylink.org. Jennifer is an environmental historian and has been leading History Link's efforts to increase and improve tribal history on the site, primarily through telling the stories of Washington's watersheds. And thank you all for being here. You can find all of the bios for our panelists in the chat box. And we will leave time at the end of tonight's discussion for your audience questions. And if you would like to submit a question to the panel, you can do so using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. Please do not submit questions in that chat box. And before we begin, I wanted to thank Gilbert King George for his contributions and for reminding us that yesterday was the 165th anniversary of the last battle of the Puget Sound Treaty War at Connell's Prairie. Charlotte Bosch, Historic Education Coordinator at Puyallup Tribe of Indians, for her assistance with developing this program. And again, all of you for being with us tonight. Thank you. Jennifer?
Great, thank you so much. And I have to second that thank you to the panel. I am very excited for this discussion and honored to be here, to be part of it. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining us all from Seattle, and which is we're the lands of the signers of the Treaty of Point Elliott. And so I'm going to give a very short overview of sort of the events leading up to the Treaty War, and so that we can have a little bit of historical context. The historian in me, I just can't help but give a little context. So, but I'll keep it short. I'd like to say that since time immemorial, Indigenous people have lived in the Puget Sound region prior to the treaty area. They lived in many villages along waterways, which are often referred to as canoe highways because they offer such a remarkably easy way to travel in this region. The tribes we know today were not as formally organized prior to the treaty era. Instead, the people living along rivers like the Nisqually or the Puyallup, or in close proximity along the saltwater shoreline, were closely associated and often members of the same families. And they often use those canoe highways, though, to travel far and wide. The regional trade networks are truly remarkable. And also those networks were for socializing and with other bands living around Puget Sound and on the inland waterways. These gatherings often led to the marriages, so many people had family connections throughout the region, including across the Cascades. When the Hudson's Bay Company established Fort Nisqually in 1833, it quickly fit into that regional trade network. Indigenous people from around the region, particularly those from the tribal communities surrounding the fort, traded furs and other natural resources for goods stocked by the British. For the most part, the trade relationships were mutually beneficial and friendly. An important reason that the HBC did not have as much conflict with local Indigenous people is that they primarily wanted to trade and limited the amount of land they wanted to control. When Americans arrived in the 1840s, however, they came as the vanguard of a country intent on expanding its borders from the Atlantic to the Pacific. At first, American settlers were integrated into that regional trade and social networks and allowed to take up lands for farms and small towns. As their numbers grew, however, conflict grew also. The Donation Land Law of 1850, passed by the American government, allowed Americans to claim large tracts of land in Oregon Territory, which Washington was a part of until 1853, and after it was ceded to the United States through treaties. That was one of the conditions of that law. An absence of treaties, however, did not hinder the earliest non-native settlers from claiming land. And by the time Washington's first territorial governor, Isaac Stevens, arrived in 1853, one of his first tasks had to be starting the treaty making process in order to resolve that issue, because there were a lot of settlers who were just designating which land they were going to claim for homesteads without regard for the requirements of the law. The Medicine Creek Treaty was the first of the Stevens treaties. It was signed in the Nisqually River Delta at Medicine Creek on December 26, 1854. So note that there's quite a bit of time that's passing here, and there's quite a bit of conflict that is happening. People representing tribal communities from a large area were present at the treaty gathering. The Medicine Creek Treaty, like other treaties signed in Washington Territory, recognized the tribes as sovereign nations, reserved rights to fishing, gathering, and hunting. So they did not cede those rights at the same time that they ceded the land. They held on to them. established reservations for groups of tribes, and ceded the remaining land with each other, within each tribe's traditional territories to the United States. In return, the federal government promised to provide annuities, schools, and medical care. And I am simplifying this very much, and you will have an opportunity to access these treaties. They're very easy to read, and they're readily available. So we will have those for you. These treaties were signed in hopes of avoiding conflict, not to conclude hostilities, as is usually the case with treaties. Instead, the Medicine Creek Treaty and others signed throughout the territory, all the way heading eastward toward the Rockies, led to war. And that leads us to our discussion tonight. And like I said, this is a very quick overview of the history leading up to the signing. And there have been many books and articles written and cultural centers that have information about these. And the museum has prepared a bibliography for further reading that they'll be sharing. And also, this is just one of what we hope will be many conversations about the relationships between Native and non-Native people in the early years of contact and following the signing of the Medicine Creek Treaty. So now that we have that little bit of context, I'd like to start with our first question, and I'm going to direct that toward Margaret. And I'm going to ask, how did the Medicine Creek Treaty affect your tribe after it was signed?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for having me as a panelist here. Truly appreciate being able to tell some of our history and our story with you all. And I hope that everyone will respect that it is our history and story to tell and share with you all. So in my position as the oral history specialist for the Squaxin Island tribe, I've had the honor of interviewing many of our tribal elders, including a few from the Quinault, Chehalis, and Upper Skagit tribe also. In this position, my boss and mentor, Rhonda Foster, and I have done a lot of research. A lot of it we did up at the University of Washington in the Suzela Library. And down in the basement is where we found a lot of good information in the Allen Library. So with this, I will share some of our history. As I mentioned earlier, my great-great-grandfather, Johnny Scallopine, was at the signing of the treaty as a young boy. And in doing some research, I found some of his words and his story. And it's truly incredible to maybe read a book or do oral history, but to see my great-great-grandfather's words in black and white, it just truly touched my heart. So our Squaxin Island tribe consisted of 7 inlets. We lived throughout the 7 southern inlets in the southern Puget Sound. My family happens to be from Bud Inlet, or the Stutchess people, and that means home of the Black Bears. So I learned that after the treaty was signed and promises were made, a lot of the promises never happened, and we all know about that. But I learned that Governor Stevens and his army gathered up all the Medicine Creek Treaty tribes. They put us in a concentration camp that was built in Bud Inlet. And from there, they shipped everybody over to Squaxin Island. The island itself is only about 5 miles wide, 5 miles long, and a half-mile wide at the largest point. It was full of old growth timber. There was no running water. At some point in the treaty, I guess they were promised that they were going to somehow take water from Olympia and take it under the bay and to the island. But of course, you know, that didn't happen. But while they were on the island, that was a lot of people to be on a small island. There were like 700 to 800 people there. And I learned that they were fed molasses. I don't know how you could live on molasses, but along with that, they had some rations, but I couldn't believe that molasses. So the government also took all their guns away. And my great-great-grandfather was wondering, why did you have to take the ammunition too? You already took all the guns. What are we going to do with the ammunition? But anyway, yeah, people ask, what started the wars? And I would say, who wouldn't want to go to war when you were taken from your home or your longhouse? We had houses throughout our 7 inlets that were 6 fathoms long to 8 fathoms long to 12 fathoms long and big. And those held many, many families. And it would take about a year to build these longhouses. We used our stone antlers to cut the cedar, and, it was a long process. And yeah, they were just taken from their homes, shipped over to the island. And there they were, with not a lot. And some of them were tortured. It's just, a really sad story. But thank goodness our ancestors paved the way for us to be who we are today. We are sovereign nations. Our tribes are very close. We have very many interwoven families. And a lot of good has come from it, but we still have a ways to go. And so I'll share that much for now.
Can I ask what the document was that you found that your grandfather's words in?
I would rather not share that right now, maybe at another point.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay. You're
Would
welcome.
anybody else like to talk about their community's experience immediately following the signing of the treaty?
I will.
Great.
And I did make notes. So for Nisqually, it was hard to survive. After the treaty signing, Nisqually lost the leaders, Quamuth and Leshai. So there again, fear set in for the tribal people. The lands that provided everyday life was taken by settlers and fenced off because of the Donation Land Act. Before the treaty, tribal people could go where the resources were, whether for food, medicine, plants, clothing, and housing. They gathered seasonally, so there were summer camps and winter homes. When the tribal leaders allegedly signed the treaties by force or because of the language barrier, did they know they were giving up 2.5 million acres, about a total of 4,000 square miles of the ceded land? Then being moved to a reservation, it was understood by the tribal people they could not go to their regular fishing, hunting, and gathering grounds. No one explained they would have to move their dead relatives from the lands they originally lived on. Leshai's body, Chief Leshai's body, was moved due to the taking lands by treaty, then condemned for the military. Families were relocated to other reservations. Some are still on other reservations. Tribal people weren't allowed to use their language and practice their traditional ceremonies. They were to be civilized and left with no tribal identity. Each generation has suffered some type of historic trauma and struggle to heal. We still deal with alcoholism and drug addiction. The more you know, the less you like what our ancestors had to deal with to survive. So that's how I feel, what the treaty did, how it affected my tribe in the signing.
It sounds like for both, it was just this sense of just tightening down on space and activity, just the things that were traditionally really important. Everything was just brought into a much narrower opportunity and space.
And, there was no understanding from tribal people to, non-tribal, there was just not that understanding that, okay, all of a sudden now you can't go gather, you can't go fish where you used to, when the settlers fenced and had to, to the Donation Land Act, they had to fence off and create their farms. So, everything was just taken away. So the big thing to me, the signing for my tribe, and others, I feel, is just that survival. All of a sudden, You know, they didn't have stores. They just went out, gathered their food, you know, but all of a sudden you don't have that, you know, so how are you supposed to survive?
Right. Yeah, the sense of fear that must have been part of the experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else? So, thank you. And for the next question, I'd like to ask Brandon. We've heard that these answers so far, which give a sense of just how drastic and intense the change was immediately after the treaties were signed. What exactly though led to the treaties causing or creating the conditions where a war would happen?
We kind of alluded to it in your introduction there with, you know, the amount of, you know, land that was going to be lost. I mean, you have, we were allowed to roam and go about wherever we wanted to, visiting family, hunting, fishing, wherever we wanted. And then all of a sudden you have Isaac Stevens show up and, you know, really present us with this treaty that said, you can't do that anymore. Not only that, but we're going to take you off of all the land that you have ever known. We're going to put you on areas that, you know, don't have access to water, don't have access to hunting, don't have access to any of your traditional places, and don't have access to your ancestors. And like Annette said, you know, and not only that, but you're going to have to take those ancestors and, you know, the ones that we allow you to have access to, you can bury if you can, but the other ones we're just going to destroy. So, you know, and then you have, on top of that, you have the knowledge that this wasn't lost on our leaders, that you had 2,000 natives going to be forced to live on 1,200 acres. Yet, if their white friends that they had helped survive when they got here, that they had provided them with resources and allowed them to stay on their land, now get access to 640 or 1,200 acres for two. You know, so four non-natives, four postates, for what we call non-natives, they had the same amount of land that 2,000 of us had. You know, that wasn't lost on our leadership, how unfair that was. And so, you know, you have that aspect, and then you have just the knowledge that, hey, this treaty is really sentencing us to death. They're cutting us off from all resources, which means starvation. And so what are you going to do? I mean, you're going to go to battle. You're going to get all your warriors. You're going to get lined up, and you're going to go to battle. You're going to start fighting for the land that you would traditionally go for. You know, that's where you have a lot of the settlers who were, you know, quote unquote, massacred by us, by our ancestors. Now, you know, they took the land that they were putting their farm on without permission. You know, what are you going to do if someone comes in and robs you? You know, you're going to stand your ground, right? You're going to defend your land, and that's what we were doing. Yeah, so I think that's kind of like the basic what led to the war. So,
could I ask the sense of place is not, as I understand it, just that the people that lived in that era, that they really loved that place. It was absolutely tied to their identity. And that a lot of the security of the community was based on that place and knowing that place so well.
oh, sure.
Could you explain that a little bit?
Well, you look at the name, we did the names of our areas described that land that we were connected to. Puyallup, or Puyallup as we know today, the Puyallup Reservation, the Puyallup Indians are traditionally known as the Puyallup, which is the place at the bend at the river. That characterized that village that land that we lived on, and there was connections to that land for thousands of years. That the bend was there, put there by the Creator, and the Creator put in that bend fish, and that fish fed us. You know, and so we have for thousands of years had told our story of how we became as a people from this river. So our connection with these places was not just, because that's where our houses were. That's where we've always lived. That's where our livelihood, that's where our family was from. That was our entire history is wrapped up in these lands that we lived on and that we used and that we cared for.
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
One of the things too, like he's talking about with the land, the land provided everything, and that's why in Native, we called it Mother Earth. You wanted for nothing because that was everything, it provided. So like with Leshai, he knew this area, other tribal people did too, but where the fishing spots are, where the, camas grow, where the berries, everything. So who would know better where their people should be than, these tribal leaders or tribal people? But then you have somebody coming from the east, and then they're trying to put you on, like Nisqually, it was a bluff away from Nisqually River. There is an article that I referred to in Pacific Northwest from this Siouxland. A lot of times what we found out was they were putting our people there because it was benefiting the landowner as labor force. They wanted them close so that they could continue to work because they worked at the fort, they helped. And so some of the lands that they were putting them on was to benefit, this other landowner who was non-Indian, got all these acres of land. So, it just wasn't fair all the way around because, like I said, a lot of the tribal leaders knew the best places. And then when you're forced to go someplace else, or like you read in a lot of the tribal people's testimonies, like they said, we want to stay where we grew up. We want to die where we grew up. We want to be by our ancestors, but now you want to take us even someplace else, but also to another reservation. We didn't grow up on that reservation, like mostly river tribes, didn't grow up around the saltwater. So it's a whole different way of life. If you grew up closer to the mountains, that was your life, compared to being down by the water. So, this was the part of it that, and I give Mr. Ekram credit for in his book, that was one of the things that stuck with me was the tribes weren't there to negotiate. They were there to sign a treaty that was already done. If you look at every piece of writing that I could find, they already had the treaty done. They wrote it up the way they wanted it, and they just expected us to come and sign. And I don't know how, there was it was the big language barrier also, that how would we understand all of this? How do you understand this stuff when you're looking at it from two different points of view?
Yeah, I
so
think what you have too is like Annette was saying, you have all these tribes, all the bands coming together, are being forced together. You had the Squaxin from Vashon and Gig Harbor. You had the folks out at the tribal folks out at Ording now being forced to come into Puyallup, all being forced onto these lands they're just not used to living on. I mean, Puyallup, like Nisqually, the reservation was 1,200 acres on top of a bluff and with no access to any type of water or anything like that. And you have all these saltwater tribes and inland tribes being forced now to try to learn how to farm, and then that sort of thing. It just wasn't how we did things. It just wasn't our way of life and how we lived. And so, all those type of things are gonna make you angry. I think it was Warren's dad really put it up at Muckleshoot, really put it into really nail it in the head. He said, the treaty was more of a declaration of war than it was anything else. And as Netzi said there was no negotiation. It was already set in place. Here's what you're going to do. Here's what you're going to sign. I don't really think they anticipated the resistance that arrived, the resistance that showed up. We saw what we could understand. We knew we were being screwed in the process, and that's fine. We're going to now have to battle for what we got left. So.
Another point that I think will come up later, I'm not sure, but in these supposedly negotiations and everything that was written, you have to put yourself back into that time era. It wasn't just like getting online like we're now and it's instant. you know, messages that went back and forth between Isaac Stevens, you know, back to DC. I mean, that was months. So all that communication never happened. So whatever he was telling them, they were thinking it was, you know, they didn't even know about the war because they were thinking everything was just fine, you know. So that big old time lag really hurt the tribes, because by time they did find out, you know, and I think it's Manny Penny, you know, had said, you know, their role was to protect the tribes. That was a part of the treaty, was that we would protect the tribes. And that wasn't happening, but that was, they didn't know that, you know. So by time you get back to the tribes, you know, half of them are probably starved to death, you know, like I said, they're trying to be put on islands and internment camps. So, you know, they're dropping heavily already, not even with the war, you know, there's other circumstances that are happening, but they're not knowledgeable of that.
Mhm. Warren, did you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, so what you've heard, Jennifer, are some pretty in-depth and concrete reasons why the tribes are here today and why they remain, because of their ancestors and their deep roots that help people understand the dependency on the land and the value. You've heard some of the other panelists mention, reference the value of the land. And we're not talking monetary value, we're talking more of a relationship, a parent, a guardianship with the land and its resources. So when we say land, we're not talking about, you know, acreage. We're talking literally about a relative. We care that much about it. And that might help some people understand why the tribes decided to not go along with Governor Stevens's strong suggestions or strong recommendations that we pull up our roots, we pull up our family, our children and grandchildren and our elders, and we move to this place forever. And you know that, you know, something like that wouldn't fly today. There's no reason why it would fly 150 years ago, 160 years ago. That's just a ridiculous recommendation or a ridiculous request to make to anybody. So and that kind of puts things into perspective and helps people understand what was being asked of the ancestors of that time, you know, that era. Just a horrible thing to do to somebody, and that reason, you know, that's still valid today. That approach and that idea and that I guess way of thinking of today, you know, we still carry that. We still hold that perspective of the value of this land, of what it means to us, what it means to our children and grandchildren, what it's going to mean to them as well. And we're going to teach that continually. That'll echo in our culture forever. And that's one thing that a treaty will never break, regardless of how many X's or how big of a title you have on that piece of paper. As my father would say, the Butjub Pipa. Butjub is a kind of a colorful word in our language.
Or say if your dad's probably said it, it probably is.
Yeah, the Butjub Pipa. And you know, it doesn't matter. You're any court case, any, you know, anything, it doesn't matter. You're not going to separate the traditional people, first people of this area from the land. They're one and the same.
What you said there about it not being just the land, the relationship, would that be a good word? Is that the people and the land have a relationship, and that
Yes.
it is that specific place? And it's so interesting because I bet Jerry could describe the non-native folks that were coming out here at that time, and the completely opposite relationship to land. How would you describe sort of the opposite of staying in one place and having a deep relationship with the land? How would you describe the non-native settlers that were coming in their relationship to the landscape?
Well, most of them had come from hundreds or thousands of miles away. And the big draw right now, as some have alluded to, is basically taking out a land claim. You cross the Rocky Mountains so that you can take 160 acres of your own choosing. And if you're married, you can end up with 320 acres. Now, there were things you had to do. You had to live on the land, you had to make improvements, you had to file a very exacting legal claim to it. But they were arriving here with very little knowledge of who had been here before them, who had been here for thousands of years. And a lot of times, natives and settlers will appreciate a piece of land for basically the same reason. Everybody needs access to water. Everybody needs access to resources, sometimes for different reasons. Some of the settlers came here looking at the tall timber and picturing the sawmills they could make and get rich. With the natives also, something that's important to realize is that it wasn't just one piece of land that they used the year round. As some have alluded to here tonight, there's one point where you're at one place when the fish are running. You're at another place when the berries are ripe or when the camas is ready to be dug. If the government comes and says, well, this is the piece of land you can have, and maybe none of those resources are there on that piece of land, I think we can all feel, if a spaceship landed today and somebody said, these little green men come out and say, we represent the great green father, and everybody in North America needs to move to, we'll reserve all of Alberta for you. How's that? Good deal, sign here. There would be resistance to the end for something like that.
I think that point too, where they're coming potentially thousands of miles, it's sort of the opposite sort of rhythm of life, is that you have one group of people who are staying in one place, and then the people coming to the West Coast are the most mobile of humans at that time, I think. They're moving across the continent. And so you have two very different understandings of how do you find a place to be and what leads you to particular places. And so, the just complete lack of understanding of what it's like to be committed to staying in one place is a really key part of, I think, the expectation that it would not end in war. So,
and I think I'll point out too, go ahead, Nancy.
Okay. I just wanted to comment because I've always felt with these, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but with these settlers, pioneers, all these people were running from, the reason they were coming is, I guess in reality, you could say that's all they knew, but that's exactly how they treated us. You do not own anything, you can't prosper, I mean, when you think about it, not to defend it, but if that's all you know and that's how you treat people, it's like that's what happened to us, because you're coming here running from something, trying to escape. I mean, they came from England and everywhere else, but you're coming from the East and you're trying to get away from something that you're doing to the tribal people that were here.
I had never thought about it that way. That's fascinating to think about. Yeah. And Brandon, what did you want to add?
Well, I was going right along those same routes as Netzi was, those people that were coming here weren't weren't the cream of the crop. Because the deposits coming weren't like, these were what Nancy said, but then they were also the murderers, the cheats, the liars, that were trying to escape the law. They were trying to escape whatever, they were trying to avoid back east, and they knew that they could get their freedom and get away from any type of jail time or hanging or, so these weren't exactly, they weren't coming over here with the best of intentions either. They were coming over here knowing, that they can get away with stuff. So
some of those new towns were rough places for just that reason, I think.
I think if you research some of the settlers that came, we named some spots after, you might realize their history isn't so pretty. So
they were moving right along. So okay, I got caught up in the conversation. Let me make sure we're oh goodness. Well, we're okay. Let's see. The next question is for Jerry. How can the effects of the treaty war still be seen today?
Well, as far as visual effects, there's of course the monuments and plaques scattered around a lot of locations, but another lasting reminder, I think, is some of the place names that we'll find. See, Leschi Park in Seattle, Leschi School in Puyallup. There's even a fireboat, named for Leschi in Seattle, and others that you don't readily recognize as having come from the time of the war. The Canasket, and I apologize if I am mispronouncing the name, but the Canasket part of Canasket Palmer State Park is named for a leader who joined the resistance to the treaties. Also, on the other side of the firing line, if you go to Mount Rainier, you'll see Couts Creek, which is named for an Army lieutenant who was wounded in a charge at Muckleshoot Prairie near the end of the war. Also, he left some native descendants here in this area as well. I remember visiting the Nisqually tribal office quite a few years ago and seeing one of the names on the desk being Couts. Now, Medicine Creek itself disappeared from the map, reappearing as McAllister Creek. If you go to the Bully Frank National Wildlife Refuge now, the boardwalk out there goes along a large part of what's now called McAllister Creek. Well, that name comes from an early settler who, James McAllister, who was the first casualty of the Treaty War. He was shot dead October 27th, 1855. The place where it happened was Connell's Prairie, and Connell's Prairie took its name from an Irish-born settler by the name of Michael Connell, who was shot along with McAllister in that same volley of fire. Now, beyond the superficiality of place names, one of the chief effects of any war generally is that it kills people. And the war deprived the native population of a number of their leaders. Quite a number of the leaders of the resistance to the treaties were killed. Canasket was killed leading a night attack on the soldiers' camp in February 1856. Stahai, I do apologize for mispronouncing that name as well, another of the Medicine Creek Treaty signers, was killed in the war. Leschi was captured, tried, and hanged after the war. His brother Quaymuth was murdered in the governor's mansion. Kitsap was killed by his own people after the war. There's no knowing how differently history might have unfolded had a number of these people survived to help guide their people through the very difficult times that followed. And on the other side of the firing line, there was a young lieutenant, William Alloway Slaughter. He was a West Pointer here in his first major assignment. He led the military forces in the field for a large part of the opening part of the Treaty War. Now, a number of his comrades in arms, including Lieutenant Couts, went on to generalships in the Civil War. Well, that didn't happen with Slaughter. He was killed in a night attack on his camp on the 4th of December, 1855. There's no knowing how history would unfold depending on who gets taken out of the game and who stays in. Now, perhaps the greatest lasting impact of the war is that it led to the Fox Island Council. Militarily, the war was a disaster for the native population, and that they were completely overmatched in numbers and resources. But when you look at the Fox Island Council, well, the resistance was not totally in vain. It wasn't perfect what happened there, but it was a great improvement over what happened at Medicine Creek, at least at the council in August 1856. Governor Stevens started to pay some attention to what the native population needed as far as a place to live. The reservations were still small, but at least they were in places where the population had been and where they had pasturage for horses, access to water, and some of the other things that were needed. It also created the Muckleshoot reservation, which was not part of the original Medicine Creek Treaty. I see the hand up from Warren. Well, beyond that, it becomes more difficult to separate the legacy of the treaty and the legacy of the war. In the popular mind today, I know when, I'm speaking as a non-native, a lot of the non-native people that I've talked to, when they found out I was working on a book, well, they said, well, what are you going to say about the Bolt decision? That was one of the articles of the treaty. It was in almost every treaty. It was Article 4 in the Point No Point Treaty. It was Article 3 in the Medicine Creek Treaty. And it began the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations is further secured to said Indians in common with all citizens of the territory. Now, in the century and more that followed, that was interpreted a number of ways. Generally, if the government has all the power, the government tries to interpret it in a way that's favorable to its interests. And it led to fish-ins in the 1960s, some very violent confrontations. I have nothing but respect for some of the people who came into that and risked a great deal to try to right what had been a very fundamental wrong. But in 1974, Judge George Bolt interpreted that wording to mean that the native population was entitled to half of the harvestable fish catch for the year. And I'm certainly not rash enough or brave enough to set myself between the native population and the commercial fisheries industry or sports fishermen. But that is a number well, it's another place where the past and the present intertwine in our lives.
It is. It's a good example of why it's so important to understand the treaties and know them. And it's interesting. I've always thought of the reservation legacy of the reservations as the biggest kind of visible outcome of the war itself. How about anyone else? Is there anything else that you think of as something that we see today that is a direct outcome that of the war that is kind of visible that you see?
Well, I would like some of the stuff that, I guess why we're here tonight is the war, the treaty war really was caused because of the land. It wasn't against settlers, it wasn't against that kind of thing. And that's kind of the thing that I would like to, get straightened out, because we weren't, just going to war with people. It was all about the land. It was about the bad reservations, the bad places that we were put on. And that's kind of what, when you see these forts, whether it's Fort Nisqually, Fort Vancouver, these were trading forts. They were not, military forts at the beginning, So that's the big problem that we always have with the history when it's written by, a lot of non-Indians that have written it haven't gone back to, giving, I guess you'd say, the tribal point of view. But some of the effects that I see today is because of that land, we are now, and all of us tribes are involved in this, buying back our land that we ceded. It's like, that's not right, but that's what we do for our people. So when we get economically, advantaged, that's a part of giving back to our tribe. We've created clinics, hatcheries, all of this stuff that has happened that we probably would have done years before if we would have still had the land. But because of that, we don't. We're now in government to government, relationships, treated a little bit better. I don't want to say, what much, but, tribes have also created laws that protect tribes. It's for the tribe. It's not somebody else creating this regulation or this law. But, some of these effects that came from this war and what happened and what, Leshai and a lot of the other leaders that, like I said, allegedly signed it, we're fighting for, we're trying to pick up at that way down the line here, but people look at it different. They just kind of like, oh yeah, you guys got a casino, you got this, that provides for our people. So we're not sitting there requesting handouts or rations. Like if you look in the history, we were given rations or handouts. Now we're providing for our people. And it's like, what's so wrong with that? Why do people look at it differently when that's all we're trying to do? We're not rich by any means. I would not be working today, if I could survive on what they kind of think, we're doing. And everything that I say is for our next generation, so they don't have to go through, that they don't have to be in the same spot that we're in. But it's just like, like you said, it's always these effects, it's that historic trauma. It's like we're always climbing uphill, trying to get over to the other side. And, so it's still there. It's still with us. The generations, it's really hard for them to see because they didn't have to live it. It's hard for us to even imagine, as the more I read, like I said, the harder it gets, because I see this devastation that they had to go through. I put my hands up to them because if it wasn't for our ancestors and just being that strong, we would never survive. We wouldn't be here today, but we are. So we really have to live up to that. And that's why I feel it's the tribal people's responsibility to take this on and really move forward with it and just correct this history. And that's a part of it where it's supposed to be happening in schools. Schools, there's a bill, there's a law, they're supposed to be teaching about their local tribes.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's happening because my kids are grown, but that's something that should be happening, in
My kids certainly learned far more than I did. There's still room to grow.
Mm.
So Warren, I saw your hand. I think it's, I'll just throw in really quickly there that when I met your father and heard his stories, that what Netsie was just saying is what stuck with me is the gratitude toward the elders that carried things forward when they didn't know that it was going to be effective or it was going to work. I remember hearing stories your dad was telling and just thinking that of like to have that faith to just keep doing the work is pretty remarkable.
That's right.
To carry the community forward. So I'm sorry, what were you going to add?
So you posed the question to Jerry earlier about what is it that we see today?
Mm-hmm.
And I think another part of that question or a follow-up question would be is what you don't see. You don't see Lushootseed or traditional language as their first language. You don't see healthy communities. You don't hear. You don't see some of the positive things that a lot of the culture and the teachers and the elders talk about and preach about. You don't see that those things about the characteristics that help define an Atzes Talbilch, a native person. You don't see that as often as you once did, or as often as our elders did. And there's things that you don't see that that are gone because of assimilation, because of what the treaty did do, that continued suppression, and it was open. It wasn't hidden. It was blatant oppression and suppression. That was the agenda. That was part of the objective, and it still is to this day. But fortunately, in this day and age, we've learned to play the game. I guess is a nice way to say it. There's an arena that some people are really gifted at entering and are able to talk and able to create and craft ways that tribal people can continue to learn more about their identity and create more opportunities to be Atzes Talbilch. There's more opportunities to relate to your identity and show your identity without being shamed for it. So I think there's things that those are the type of questions I think are some of the things that you don't see or that you do see. And so that, it's a two-sided question, a two-sided coin, if you ask me. And I think that that's important to understand and realize as well. That'll help people understand a little bit more about what it's like to be a foster child or someone who's in care of the federal government. And that's who's supposed to be taking care of us. That's part of the treaty. That's part of the agreement. And if you take a look around at some of these local villages around here, who's taking care of who? Is that obligation being met? Has that obligation been met? And in most cases, I'm going to say no, straight up. So you've heard testimony from elders here on this panel about how things used to be, and grateful and thankful for people who were willing to go forward and pave the way, open doors, open windows and opportunities so that our people can survive in this world via treaty. It's not because of the treaty. It's because of the crafty leadership that we've had, these descendants of the warriors from the first treaty war. That's who's opening these doors and opening these windows for our young people to benefit and to continue our legacy to this land and to the people, our family, our relatives, our extended family.
Yeah. Thank you. Margaret?
I just wanted to add a little bit to what Lauren was just talking about. You know, our ancestors paving the way. They just went through so much, but they truly thought about our people when they were signing this treaty. They were thinking about our future generations, our children, our grandchildren. They did the best that they could to make sure we were able to continue to fish, to hunt, to go clam digging, to gather oysters, to even gather our materials for basketry, our clothing. And to top it off, they thought about our health and well-being. Today we have Indian Health Service, which helps out a lot. I'm happy to say that we are able to have our first salmon ceremony annually. We still can go out and fish and clam dig. And we are so thankful to our salmon people for being so strong too, for learning the lessons from our ancestors back in the day so that they could help take care of us. And I know a lot of tribes have the first salmon ceremony, and a lot of times we just call it first salmon. We know it's a ceremony. We do it every year. So we just can't thank our ancestors enough. We just have so much gratitude for them. And we'll continue to try to keep their story, their history alive, you know, for future generations.
Thank you.
Without our salmon, our people would have been in a world of hurt as people of the water. Yeah. And could I just say one other thing too? I believe Netzie, was it 2016 you guys hosted Canoe Journey? Okay. Yeah, okay. In 2016, you know, the Nisqually hosted our canoe journey, and they took the time to invite people out to the Medicine Creek, to the original spot where our treaty was signed. We hadn't been there as a people, as a group. And I'm talking natives and non-natives that were there to watch, but we had people singing and drumming in canoes. And it was so sacred. And during that time, they honored the past and present chiefs. And they honored my late Uncle Philip Martin Sr. from Quinault. And I was so grateful and honored to be able to accept that gift on his behalf. And later that week, I went and I was able to deliver that beautiful gift to his son, David Martin. So just thank you to the Nisqually tribe. And I know Puyallup did a wonderful job with their canoe journey too, and along with Quinault. And my daughters cannot wait for us to be able to go to canoe journey again. They miss, you know, the laughter, the singing, the drumming, eating the food, you know, potlatching, having a good time. So I think we're going to see that. There's light at the end of the tunnel here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And now, if anybody who's watching does not know about Canoe Journey, you should Google it. It's absolutely amazing and a wonderful thing. Restarted in 1989, right? And
Yes.
it's just an amazing experience. I have not attended, but I have watched the videos, the live videos of
Oh, we'll have to get you out there.
And oh, that would be amazing. So, okay, so we are getting close to just about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask you all to kind of combine the last two questions we had. And I apologize to Netzie and Warren that I'm not directing them to you to have the first start, but I'll just say that if you could talk about what it means to come together for a conversation like this. I mean, we can see the response from the number of people that are attending. It means a lot to people, and I mean, I'm incredibly honored to be here. And where do we go from here? Like, what would you like to see happen? either in the community or, you know, the people listening, whatever you would like to share. And who should I start with? Netzi?
Yes, because you know I'll step in. With this question, you know, with this diverse group, I like is that the tribal people on the panel are involved in what is being discussed. I think this is the start of more conversation in order to get the whole story out to the public. From the tribal point of view, we are certainly not the only tribal people with the background. Our tribal elders have a lot more knowledge and experience, good or bad. I think this discussion is long overdue, and it is the tribal people's responsibility to set the record straight. In order for the next generation to know the history and gain the knowledge as our next tribal leaders, our youth need to be more involved and included in these discussions. So, you know, I sit on different boards, different, you know, committees, and that's one of the things I bring up. I personally want our youth, our tribal youth, to feel comfortable, you know, being in these conversations. You know, when you see us, and I'm not saying we're all old, but, you know, they need to feel comfortable being on, you know, like in the Burke, we're on the Native American board, you know, they need to feel comfortable that they can sit on these boards, you know. That's one of the things I'd like to see. So I feel it's our responsibility to get that message out and to help them because, you know, they're the future leaders and that all of this needs to be included. So that's why I think it's our goal and our role to set the record straight for them. For the Nisqually, on the second part of it, you know, there needs to be more discussion. I would, you know, and as I'd stated in one of our previous meetings, we need to go back before the treaties to really understand the devastation the treaty caused our tribal people, and also have other people on the panel. There are more tribal historians and authors that contribute and have done the research to what really happened. For Nisqually, I refer the requests I received to the books by Cecilia Svint Carpenter, historian for the Nisqually tribe. Other books I reference are Abby Wanacott, I hope I'm saying her name right, Where the Michelle Meets the Nisqually, the Michelle Massacre of 1856. This is in direct connection with the treaty wars. You know, I've given the book to others and they're like, well, you know, it was hard to read. And I go, but that's the truth. You know, it's the truth. And that's what a lot of people don't want to read about. So I highly recommend they read that because it'll tell you the different side of the story. Another reference is Sue Ann Reddick and Carrie C. Collins in the Pacific Northwest Quarterly, Volume 104, Number 2, Spring of 2013, titled Medicine Creek Remediated, Isaac Stevens and the Puyallup, Nisqually, and Muckleshoot Land Settlement at Fox Island, August 4th, 1856. Very thorough on their research, you know, on what happened on these things. So when people are needing, you know, the public needs references, there's a lot out there, but please read everything, even if it's hard to read. My husband's Blackfeet and he has a hard time reading some of the things that they write about his tribe, you know, but I tell him, just get through it, you know, see what our ancestors were treated like, you know, it puts it in perspective, you know, it tells us what we're going to leave our tribe when our time is done, you know. So like I said, they're hard reads, but it's worth it to see what actually happened back then, because for us, we can only imagine it.
It's very true. Yeah. So how about Warren next, since you were the one that was going to get the last question?
Yeah, sure. So Jennifer, you want me to address where do we go from here?
Sure. Or if you'd like to say anything about what's it like to be here having this conversation, feel free to do that too.
Yeah, so I'll touch on that a little bit. I have a thought that I think that a lot of non-natives might not be aware of, is that it used to be kind of a challenge for intertribal business. Because we're native, because we're the same race, it doesn't mean that we always got along. So if those of you out there who are going to do some research on the Medicine Creek Treaty, take a look at what happened to Putkanum and some of his constituents. We didn't always see eye to eye on things, and we weren't on the same page. Also, in this day and age, now fast forward to today, look how far we've come, because we all share a lot of same issues, dealing with treaty rights, dealing with social issues that are because of treaty rights or because of the government's hidden agenda or not so hidden agenda. We have that in common now, and we're talking, probably 6, 7, 8 generations now. And chances are, this panel that you see here of Untitled were related in one way or another. Our bloodlines cross. So we're considered extended family at this juncture. And so I consider it a great honor to be included with this group of people who hold a great amount of respect in their village in order for them to be sent here. And I'm grateful and thankful for them to share their time and share some of this information and wisdom about this very important topic. So that's what I have to say about that question. Where do we go from here? We keep moving forward, Jennifer. We keep the same pace, but I want to remind everyone to keep an eye in the rear view mirror. Keep an eye in that passing lane mirror. Don't forget, every once in a while, I want to remind you to look back and recall those experiences, recall those memories, recall those lessons that were learned by our elders, that were learned by our ancestors, because those lessons may apply to this road that we are all on together. This trail moving forward, it's got a lot of mud puddles, it's got a lot of speed bumps, and we need to reference those lessons, those life's lessons, in order for this commuter lane that we're in to run smoothly. So thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak to those points?
Well, it just reminded me of something that Mark Twain said once. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. It doesn't come back the same way, but history does have lessons that every generation seems to have to learn all over again. It'd be nice if we could keep those lessons and not have to learn them the hard way so many times.
It's very true. Yeah. Brandon?
I'd say, where do we go from here? I'd definitely say, a lot of our audience is at least, historians or at least just interested in history. We're still here. The tribes, we're still right in front of you. Where you have representatives from each one of these tribes. The treaty in one aspect, you can see it today in the very people that are still here. And so reach out to the tribes. I always tell people, reach out to the historians the tribal historians as you're writing your books and you're writing your theses and your whatever you're doing. Get our perspective. You're supposed to tell the whole story. So tell the whole story. Contact us. We're here. Our contact information is on the web. I think we all have Facebook pages or something. Social media. Get our side of the story and then be willing to actually use it. Don't embellish it. Don't make it too hard to read. Don't make it, the truth needs to be told. You need to be willing to hear it, and you need to be willing to print it if you're gonna write a history book. So
that's a really good point. One of the things I found, I've been attending the Squamish Summit for the past few years, and it's not exactly my lane, but what I've taken from it is that I have an opportunity to listen and sort of learn what I don't know, in a way that it's just incredibly useful. Just that, just new questions to ask as I do my research and new ways to make sure that I'm looking at different angles of a story or an event. And, it's made me a better historian, I hope. So
one of the things I'd like to I do say at other meetings, it's not, with tribes, it's not one size fits all. You know, tribes are different. They have different governments, they have different councils. Everything is different. So you can't just research one tribe and think that
Yes.
you can go to another tribe. We get that all the time when we get new employees. They're like, oh, I work for that tribe, like different tribe, you know. So, you know, there's different culture, there's different, just, you know, even language is different, you know, even in Lashutsi, there's a northern, southern. So, you know, don't just put everybody together and say, oh, we know it all, you know. So do the research. You know, I'm always surprised at people that apply for jobs at Nisqually, and the first question you ask them is, well, what do you know about Nisqually? Well, you know, and it's like, wouldn't you research the tribe before you apply at the tribe? You know, so
So at least
yeah,
go to History Link.
yeah, but it's just, they don't do, you know, and like I tell them, we have a website, you know, you can go to our website and learn what you need to do. But we get requests all the time, and sometimes, you know, you just shake your head and go, really, you know, they don't really know this. But, you know, trying to get that out there is, just because you've been in touch with one tribe doesn't mean all tribes work the same. They expect us to, like, you know, oh, can your tribal chair sign this? I'm like, our tribal chair meets once a week. You know, they're on the road. You know, we can't just have all that done. So yeah, you really need to do your research on each tribe and how they function.
That's very true. Okay, so Margaret and Jerry, I do not want to rush you, but we have amazing questions here. And so would you like to, Margaret or Jerry, would you like to add anything, or should we go on to questions?
On to questions for my part.
On to questions.
Okay. I really don't want to cut you off, but there are really great questions, and we only have about 15 minutes left. So, okay, I will scroll up to the top. Some of these are kind of nuts and bolts questions. And so Kelly asks, were the Squaxin sent to Squaxin Island before the October 1855 hostilities?
It was before. I believe it was before.
Okay, yeah. So it was even before there was a threat of danger, really.
And also there was a pretty large internment on Fox Island as well during the hostilities. There were, I think, at least 600 natives on Fox Island as well. So the term concentration camp had not been invented, but it was pretty close to the same concept.
Essentially that. This question is, I have known for some time that Isaac Stevens was known, or at least is now, for his brutal tactics when negotiating with local tribes, but was there any tribe that did not experience his brutality or a lessened version of it? No, I think it was pretty universal across the territory that he was treating with. Yeah. Let's see.
I'd like to comment that, with him, from what I've researched, he had his own agenda, and he was coming here with, directions from his higher people. So, when you come with that kind of an attitude, it doesn't matter what you find, you're just going to do what they tell you to do. And you're trying to you're trying to step up that ladder, into maybe a different position, higher position. So, from what I've said, it was hurried. He wanted to get them done as fast as possible. He wanted them all on one reservation. He wanted all the land done. I mean, it was just, he had his own agenda. So it was, no matter where he went, that's the way it seemed that he treated everybody.
Yeah. He was, and what I understand is, what I've read is, he was that way with his own soldiers as well. It wasn't just,
it was his entire
ethos. It wasn't racial. It was, he was just, there was maybe he was more of a politician than a soldier.
He does have that feel of somebody kind of swooping in and wanting to just wrap everything up as quickly as possible so that he could look good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Margaret.
I was told that Governor Stevens had his son sign our treaty, our Medicine Creek Treaty. Just as something funny, thought it was a joke.
Yeah.
Yeah,
the lack of respect. I mean, by the end of his tenure, he'd made so many people angry for his lack of respect for process and everything. You know, it does seem like he just wanted to get the finished product at whatever cost to form or function or relationships. Yeah. Let's see, the next question is there a general understanding or proof of whether the signatures on the treaties were coerced or forged? A mix of both, maybe.
Well, it's very hard to say what's a forgery on it, because the way it was signed was apparently one of the people sponsoring the treaty, Governor Stevens or someone, held up a piece of paper with an X on it, and they said, "Make this." Now, whether that was recognized as a binding agreement, it's hard to say. I mean, in our, in the culture that Stevens came from, a signature on a piece of paper had a very significant meaning. But it's really hard to tell a forgery. All the X's look basically the same. It's just an effort with a quill pen, which was, among other things, pen and ink was I think probably a new experience for most of the natives who would come there. So the X's are there. Who made them? We could debate that forever.
My comment is when you look at the history of tribes, it was all oral history. They didn't have paper that they wrote, made notes, even wrote an X. You know, a lot of elders, a lot of people that, I've come in contact with, not even just from my tribe, but others, they will start in on a story, and I'm standing there going, I know this story. Then the light bulb goes off. It's like, oh, this is oral history. They repeat it. And in tribes, everybody had their duty. And a lot of times it was elders, that sat down and told the stories to the young, while the parents were out taking care of business. But so how can you say they understood things when all they had was oral history? They didn't even know what a pen was, what a paper was. So you want them to do something that, is beyond, what they've ever had to do. So a lot of times I'll tell people, if I hear a story and they've told me that it's come from a tribal elder, wasn't written down, it's like, I believe it, because they were taught oral history from, the beginning, and that's what they passed on, so you hear a lot of them do that. They'll tell you a story over and over until you memorize it, you've got it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I
go
usually tell people, you look at the X's, they all look the same. There are a few that are different, but for the most part, they're the same. And I always tell people, go write a clear calligraphy X. I'll show you how to write it. Now you do it. And how often do you think people can write a calligraphy X or a calligraphy anything, unless they've been trained in it, And so you'll usually find out that, it's hard to do. So what is the likelihood that, that they actually signed it? So you can see the evidence in that alone. So.
Right, and not to mention the language barrier, they had to have translators translate from English to the Chinook jargon, then from the Chinook jargon to our Southern Lushootseed language. And from that, we had our own Squaxin dialect, like many tribes, So, yeah.
Well, they have
tough.
They have the term lost in translation for a reason. You really wonder how much, from the English, by the time it got to the Squaxin dialect and had gone through three hands, how did it how did it play out? The Chinook jargon was very limited. It was created basically as a trade language for one tribe or one nationality who didn't speak the other person's language to get across simple ideas and simple concepts. And there was nothing simple about the concepts being laid out at Medicine Creek. And the other limitation on Chinook jargon is that the person using it always comes across as rather unintelligent to the other person, just because they are completely limited in what they are able to say. It worked very well for trading a beaver pelt for a blanket, but for the concept of changing an entire way of life, it had huge limitations.
They sort of picked the worst possible way to get to what was their stated goal, which kind of gives you a sense that maybe their stated goal was not the goal. The next question is, how much of the native population had been, I hate this word because it makes, but wiped out by introduced disease prior to the treaty, and how much after? So those early epidemics that came through and were just so incredibly lethal to the community, and then before and after. So can you give a sense of like where the impact was? Like where were we in that whole waves of disease at the time of the treaty?
Well, there's no way of knowing for certain, but it was apparently quite devastating. Waves of smallpox, measles, a lot of things that had made its way up from the Columbia River to Puget Sound before even Fort Nisqually was there. I think the first attempt at a census, Dr. Tolmie was asked to do a census in 1838. Most of the estimates are well over half the population of Puget Sound had probably perished within the last 60 years at that time. Some villages along the Columbia River where it was especially devastating. Some villages were essentially wiped out. Some people had said as much as 90% perished. It's hard to get exact numbers. I don't know that anyone can, but it was devastating. It certainly makes COVID-19 seem like a paradise by comparison to what people faced at that time.
Well, one of the things that people, I feel that's a part of this history that needs to be corrected. When they went through and you are looking at what they think is a village, it's really not a village. In these longhouses, you had families, you had extended families. So that could have been one family. So if they stay together, live together, just like you see in the COVID, it wipes out the whole family. So the only ones that probably didn't get affected were the ones that were, if they were out hunting, gathering, or some kind of ceremony someplace else. But that's where a lot of people you hear, oh, this band or that village, and it's like, that's not a village, that was a family. So, when you come up on a home like that and there's nothing there, you can pretty much say, most of the tribe, half the tribe was wiped out, because the lucky ones were probably the ones that weren't there at the time, but that would be hard to count, because like I said, an extended family can be, 25 people living in that house. It doesn't mean it's a village,
Right. Yeah, and they did, the disease epidemics did start prior to contact with non-native folks, and so a lot of the loss is before the treaty era, which I think is a really important thing to imagine, just how that affects a group of people. And so it, you know, kind of gives you a sense of the world they were living in at that time. Yeah. This next one is pretty specific, so I'm just going to hold on to it and maybe we can answer it afterwards. Let's see. One gap I have is how women were involved in tribal leadership in the Puget Sound region. I don't know enough about the men whose names are on the treaty, but I don't know anything about the women who may have had an influence at that time. I know women were history keepers in some nations farther north. Was that a tradition in this region? Are there any recordings written or passed down from women that can give us more insight? Yeah, Brandon.
No, so yeah, definitely. I think a lot of that, in fact, if you follow us on Facebook, we kind of, on today's post, we actually brought this up a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, there definitely were women leaders. There definitely were women in power. We have one documented the Minter Creek site out in the Minter area. She was a descendant of our late historian Judy Wright. She was a descendant of this woman leader that we have at least one documented of. But you know, women were essential to the very livelihood of every village, every family. So naturally, they're going to be leaders. And I think a lot what happens is you have these ethnographers, you have these non-natives that come into these areas that are like, well, you women can't be leaders, you know. And so the fact that we had women that were in leadership was too foreign to them to even really comprehend, let alone recognize. But yeah, we definitely have in our oral history, and again, that we at least have one documented tribal leader in the Minter village. You know, so definitely they were there. Just naturally, you're going to have women leaders. They were essential for everything, for the very livelihood. All we men did was go hunt and fish. So the keeping villages alive was definitely because of the women's roles in that village.
The things too that with tribes, oh sorry Warren, is now I don't want to say just the chiefs, but a lot of them had several wives, which was, you know, they were forced to discontinue. But so, you know, these women had a lot of involvement because, you know, if you got all these wives doing everything and being a part of this, you know, they're actually keeping the village, the band, the tribe together. So, you know, they had to be there and they had to have these responsibilities. The thing that, you know, with several wives, what a lot of people don't understand either is when, you know, a lot of times these men married sisters, but it was because the sister might have been widowed. And so who took care of her? You know, she was taken into that family with the other sister, with the husband, and the husband took care of her. When they outlawed, and one of them was Indian Henry, when they wanted him to choose a wife, you know, it was like, how do I do this? You know, what do I do? What happens to this woman? You know, where does she go? You know, there's going to be nobody there to take care of her. So in tribes, that's the way it was. So you took care of your women, whether you had, you know, 2 or 3 wives, but they also took care of the, you know, the tribe, the home, the village. And to me, that's a part of leadership because you have, you know, otherwise they wouldn't have survived, you know.
So thank you all. I promised that I would end this at a reasonable time. We could do hours. We have so many great questions that I think we should save them and do a whole nother panel just on the questions, because truly these are spectacular questions. I'll just throw out a couple quick answers. That there's some question about the curriculum and that is taught in schools. And I'll say that since time immemorial is something that's publicly available, I encourage people to look that up at OSPI. And then also there is a Senate bill this session that is related to tribal history being taught in the public schools. Mm-hmm. And then another person has asked about Billy Frank Jr., a statue of him replacing Whitman. And that's such a timely issue. I think I'll pull that one out too and just say, that's a really important issue that's being discussed right now. I don't know if it's made it past the deadlines that are happening in the legislature, but there's a new book out called Uncommon Ground about the Whitman tragedy. And there's a whole discussion going on that I think people might, if they're interested in what we're talking about here, they would be interested in that. And so I have to say thank you very much. Oh, and
I
Nettie.
do have one comment on the school part of it.
Mhm.
Just a fair warning to schools, when you get this tribal liaison, please do your research. Just because somebody claims they have native blood or they're enrolled, like I was saying, tribes are not the same. So if you're going to hire somebody at your school to teach about the local tribe, please make sure they know, the interview questions need to be relevant to what is a local tribe, what are you teaching? Because we still have the schools teaching about, and no offense, but like Navajos who aren't local, Blackfeet, my husband's Blackfeet, but it's like in your local schools, that's what you should be teaching is about the local tribe. So be very careful on who you're hiring, because it does cause a lot of tension in the schools, with who they're getting to teach these.
I can imagine.
About that.
Yeah. So thank you all so very much. This has been amazing and lovely to meet you all. And I know Elizabeth would like to come back on and say thank you and good night also, but really thank you for talking with me.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you all. This has been a tremendous program. There's a great response from our chat, and I'll be sure to share that with everyone. I just wanted to reiterate a couple quotes I heard from you guys tonight at the end. There are a lot of different stories out there, stories from people that are still here that are encouraging you to reach out to them. So we encourage that from you. And Maureen, I just love it. I don't know if I've heard history said so succinctly. Keep moving forward, but keep your eye in the rear view mirror.
Yes.
It's beautiful. So again, we will follow up with all of our attendees tonight. Do reach out to us if you have questions or if you want further information. We can direct you where to go. Thank you all so much. And we will see you again soon.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
It's been a pleasure.